Hello and welcome to another episode of Let's Talk Human Rights. Today we're going to be looking at the way in which the human rights regime works when it comes to protecting the rights of persons with disabilities and when it comes to the right to health. Now, of course, these are separate and distinct topics, but there are some interesting overlaps, as we will see. And I have with me today two experts, but I will leave it to them to introduce themselves. So, Jen, would you like to start by introducing yourself?
Thank you, Sally. So my name is Jennifer Sellin, and I'm an assistant professor at the Department of International and European Law at the Faculty of Law. And I teach and I do research within international human rights law, specifically with regard to the right to health, access to essential medicines, and also a bit with regard to human rights of women.
So I'm a PhD candidate at Faculty of Law. So my study explores how disabled people's organizations, that's a kind of a civil society organization from European countries, have interacted with some UN human rights mechanisms to monitor the national implementation of the UN Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. And I will call them UN Disability Convention from now on. And I hope to study what obligations states have to support the disabled people's organizations in the process, and if there are UN principles to follow, and what impact these organizations have on the international monitoring of the Disability Convention.
Yeah, thank you very much.
Thank you.
So we heard a little bit about Han's research. Do you want to tell us a little bit about what you researched, Jen?
Yeah, so I did my PhD on the topic of access to essential medicines for people in low and middle income countries specifically, and then I really looked into the relationship between intellectual property law, so specifically patents, and human rights law. So how do these two interact? Are there conflicts, or how can they coexist? And I've kind of continued with that topic also, and of course now access to medicines is no longer only an issue for low and middle income countries, but has also become an issue for high-income countries, and is of course super interesting at this time with a global pandemic going on. So that is kind of my area of focus.
And is there anything in particular that got you into this research?
Yeah, so that is a very interesting question. So no, to be honest, when I was asked to do a PhD, and I honestly hadn't really thought of this as an option. I was young and had no idea really what I wanted to do with my life, except that I thought, okay, something within the field of human rights. But when I saw the topic, and I actually really was immediately passionate about that topic, because it is something, that is really, affects, millions of people worldwide. And it has been an issue for, over 2 decades, and it continues to be an issue. And it's, almost tragic to say that we haven't really been able to resolve that yet. So that is kind of how I got into it. I kind of, I got into academia, like some people, by accident, but I'm really happy that I'm here. And it's a wonderful job in many ways.
And how about you, Han? Did you also fall into research by accident, or did you know that this was something you wanted to do?
I think a little bit both, because before I started my program, I have worked in, I would say, Northeast Asia on disability rights and disability research for like 6-7 years.
Okay.
So I always enjoyed working on this area, and I always enjoyed working with the disabled people's organizations there. So when I see the topic, I just find it's really interesting. I think maybe I should give it a try. And that's my story.
Yeah, and that's how we ended up here. Nice. So I want to start by just asking what are the rights that we're talking about here? So we have the rights of persons with disabilities, the right to health. Maybe I can start by asking you, Han, what are the rights that you research here?
Yeah, so my research is mainly based on the UN Disability Convention I talked about. So this convention, I would say it's the latest international human rights treaty so far, and it's considered as a milestone treaty and a legal document in international law for persons with disabilities, because it represents what we call the shifting paradigm for persons with disabilities, because before the convention, in many countries, I would say even for Western European countries, we use these countries use a welfare model, and in many cases a medical model to see persons with disabilities. So which means that persons with disabilities are considered as not perfect, and they need to be fixed, they need to be changed under the help with medical experts. But because of the Disability Convention, persons with disabilities are considered as rights holders, and actually they were actively participated in the drafting of the Disability Convention, and I think that's also a first time for civil society to participate in the negotiation of such convention. So participation is a really important part, or meaningful participation of persons with disabilities is a very important part of the Disability Convention. And my research focused on, there were 2 articles in this convention. The first article asked the states to take this general obligation to support persons with disabilities and their organizations in the policy making and lawmaking process. And the second article I look into in my research relate to this one is that they also asked a person with disabilities to participate in to be included in the national mechanism and to implement and monitor the CRPD.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so yeah. I hope that answered the question.
Yeah, sure. There's a lot in there. I'm sure we'll come back to some of it.
Yes, please.
For just picking up on what you said about the UN Disability Convention as presenting persons with disabilities as rights holders, is that notion of reframing an issue and putting these people as or putting people in the place of rights holders rather than I don't know if the right term is maybe a charitable object or something. Is that something that you also see in your work on the right to health?
Mm-hmm. Yes, absolutely. I think this comes down to one of the fundamental aspects of human rights is that we see individuals, and groups for that matter, as right holders, and on the other side we have, of course, duty bearers. And this is where the right to health and many other rights have played an important role. So, with the right to health and actually other what we refer to as economic, social, and cultural rights, which are rights, things like the right to food or the right to housing or the right to work. These are rights that have only, I wouldn't say recently because it's not that recent, but they have developed or have been acknowledged as rights only later. And really with the, and even with the establishment of the human rights regime after the Second World War and the Universal Declaration of Human Rights in 1948, but even after that we see a kind of distinction between, on the one hand, kind of freedoms and the traditional liberties, civil and political rights, and on the other hand, socioeconomic rights like right to housing and the right to health. And that has really been a struggle, I think, for socioeconomic rights and the right to health to be recognized as a full human right. And to this day, this is probably not recognized everywhere as a human right. And I think this has also, when we look at the pandemic and some of the discussions that happened during the pandemic, we also see this kind of tension between freedoms, individual rights, and more collective entitlements, like public health and the right to health. So this idea of a right holder is really what makes human rights rights, I would say.
And do you think that in what you've researched that this notion of health as a right is accepted, or do you think it's still kind of seen as more of a privilege?
That is an interesting question. I think there are varying degrees. So, from a legal perspective, as an academic working on the right to health, I would say that, health is a human right. It is enshrined in several international legal documents, in several regional documents. It is also enshrined, I think, in more than half of the world's constitutions. So there seems to be recognition of the health as a human right. We see also from the United Nations framework or even from the World Health Organization, we see that they approach health from a rights-based approach. So they do see it as a human right. But then again, there are some countries in where it is, definitely not the case, where health is not considered to be a right. And I think it varies a bit on the context, but it's not acknowledged in the same way as, say, freedom of expression maybe, or things like the prohibition of torture, as these kind of more classical definitions of what we think of as a human right. I'd be interested if you would go outside and ask a random person, give me 3 examples of rights, whether the right to health or any socioeconomic right would be one of them, even after a pandemic of almost 2 years, or more than 2 years now.
Yeah. And to also dig a bit deeper into what is the substance of the right to health, perhaps you could go into a bit more detail on that, but also at the same time, because I think there's an interesting overlap here with your work looking at the right to health, particularly in lower and middle income countries, and your work on persons with disabilities. And I'm wondering to what extent the discrimination is an element in what you look at there.
Yeah. So the right to health includes freedoms and entitlements. So that firstly, and it is encompasses 2 broad components. I think traditionally, when you think of the right to health, you think of healthcare. So the ability to go to a doctor, to get medicine, etc. But generally, in the interpretation of the right to health has said, okay, that is one component of the right to health. A second component is what we refer to as the underlying determinants of health. So things as, having adequate housing or shelter, or having adequate food and clean water, a clean environment, all things that I think are now becoming more and more important, especially, with respect to climate change and these kind of discussions. And discrimination, and I think I would be very interested to hear your view on this matter, but I would say that the principle of non-discrimination and equality is really fundamental to the human rights regime, and is kind of one of those core concepts. And unfortunately, within the health field, whether it's healthcare or the underlying determinants, we see a lot of discrimination in various aspects. Examples are things like, Black women are still much more likely to die during childbirth than white women. Why would that be? That, literally the only distinguishing character is their skin color. And only recently, I think it wasn't that long ago that the scientific community discovered that heart attacks present very different in women compared to men. Again, these are kind of they are very kind of clear examples of discrimination, but there's also kind of systemic discrimination, and I think when it comes to persons with disabilities, that is probably also a hot topic.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting that we're talking about the substance of non-discrimination, because of course, CRPD didn't create any new rights for persons with disabilities, and the same set of rights and the same principles we're following regarding right to health. But at the same time, so what does it mean for persons with disabilities to access to health? It means that I think, at least in the context of the CRPD, whether persons with disabilities have the same access to health as everyone else. And I think long-term issue in history for persons with disabilities is that they have very complicated relationship with health providers, considering that many of them didn't really consider as someone with legal capacity, so they can't make their own decisions on what kind of health they can get, what kind of medical health they can choose. And probably links to another issue with torture, because, for example, people with psychosocial disabilities, they are forced treated in psychiatric institutions, and that also cause lots of problems. For example, from restraining of their freedom, and they don't have a basic living standard compared to other people. And also, you mentioned the women with reproductive rights. It's also issue with persons with disabilities, especially those institutions that I talk about. For example, in some countries still have the practice of forced sterilization on them. So And I think from my working experience, it's also a big issue for persons with disabilities to get some what we call reasonable accommodations. So it's a kind of personal help for them to be able to enjoy the medical service. For example, for deaf people, some people, they use sign languages, so they need sign language interpreters to communicate with doctors. But in many countries, it's not considered as they're entitled for such service. So from my experience, I've talked to deaf people who are really frustrated with the whole experience to see doctor, even for the really simple things, just because they can't communicate with doctors. And doctors are really busy, so they can't really bother to listen to them. And during the pandemic, it was also an issue for deaf people, especially even in, I would say, in developed countries, that for example, in press conference, they didn't provide sign language interpreters. Or for example, autistic people, there's no easy read format on information for them. So they simply don't understand what's going on, and they cause lots of issues, like they break the rules, or they don't know that they should follow, or they don't know where to see doctors when they're in trouble. Yeah.
So it sounds, I mean, from what you've both said, that there are a lot of like intersectional issues here, both with regard to the right to health and also within the community of persons with disabilities. Do you think that within either the framework on the right to health or within the CRPD or the UN Convention on Disability, that there's space for I want to say, like, collaboration and discussion on these points of intersectionality, or are these different things almost being developed in silos, like separate to one another?
Yeah, I think that's a difficult question. I do think there is a bit of a fragmentation, if you want to call it like that, that we have so many, so from the international human rights system, we have so many individual treaties, which I think, has advantages and disadvantages. And the thing is, like, we have, for example, we have the Disability Convention, we have also the Women's Convention, we have the Children's Convention, and I think all of these add, and I think, the Disability Convention is really one of those milestones, just of how it was drafted, and, and if you look at what is included in that convention. But it does mean that there is all these also different committees, because every convention establishes a committee, and that committee, interprets the different rights and also explains what the obligations are for the state under that treaty. That there is a bit of a kind of fragmentation, that, they do try to work together. But obviously, within the committee for the Disability Convention, these are people experts in that field. While when it comes to the Committee on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, they are not experts. They might not even think of things about disability. And I think this is why representation is so important. That different groups, different experiences, different backgrounds are represented, so that people are not forgotten. Because when people are not represented, not even on purpose, but groups are just forgotten, and then we see a kind of a one-sided perspective. And I do think that you see that also in the in the development of human rights law. I don't know for certain, but I would be curious to see how often the word disability is mentioned, for example, in the general comments, the kind of authoritative documents of the Committee on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, while there are, like you said, so many examples of how people with disabilities really are, whose right to health and other rights are really undermined and not being respected. Mm-hmm. But that is definitely not an issue that has come to the forefront over the years. So, yes.
Yeah, I agree with what Jennifer said. I think there's the problems are two levels, considering the cooperation regarding human rights protection. The first is, like you said, on the UN level. We have so many international human rights treaties. I think the UN is trying to address on this issue, because I know the Convention on the Rights of Children and the CRPD are the two conventions that actually, for example, with the Children Convention, they has included include an article about persons with disabilities, and in the Disability Convention there are 2 articles about women with disabilities and children with disabilities respectively. But at the same time, it's still the case that because we have this many treaty bodies, and they kind of work on their own because they only know this much about this topic. And I think this also represents an issue with the UN, reporting system, because also country, they have to report on this conventions on what they're doing and how they achieve the human rights protection. So everything is a little bit here and there. And then the second level question, I think, is on the national implementation on the local level. I think in the issue I see, for example, with the CRPD implementation is that, for example, how do we include medical experts in our conversation when we totally use different language and approach? Yeah. Because probably medical experts think what we are trying to do is the right way to do, and we always do things this way. So we can't have lawyers come and tell us that that's not the right way to do things, right? And I think probably a practice we can encourage is that, because my study also a main focus is how civil society organizations participate in the UN reporting system. So I think if more civil societies work together on a national level during the reporting, what we call the state reporting procedure or the state review. For example, if persons with disabilities organizations, they participate in the CEDAW or in the what you call the Committee on the Economic and Social Rights. During the reporting, they work with other human rights organizations in their country, so they can provide more information on, for example, persons with disabilities, and then it will be mentioned more, or it's like a, awareness raising activity even within the UN. Yeah. So I think that's probably one approach. Yeah, we can deal with it.
I want to pick up on that as well, because I think that links to something that Jen, you said earlier about the importance of participation, the importance of representation. So yeah, you've talked a little bit about the role of civil society within the UN Disability Convention. Is that something you also see a important role for civil society in furthering the right to health?
Yeah, so I think that is anyway important for human rights in general, but within the right to health, I think so. I get the question a lot from my students when I teach human rights law. Questions like, or the question is like, all of these human rights, all of these treaties is really nice, but we can't enforce them. And anyone who studied any kind of international law, human rights law, knows that enforcement and monitoring is just very difficult at the international level. So then the question is, what is the point of having all of these treaties if we can't do anything with it? And I understand that can be very frustrating, but one of the examples that I like to give is from my own research is within the access to medicines field and the access to medicines movement that really did, I think, made a change. And they made a change, I think, for 2 reasons. First of all, because they did use human rights language. And because secondly, it was a bottom-up approach. So at the end of the last century, the late 1990s, we were in at the height, I would say, of the HIV crisis, especially in low and middle income countries, and especially in sub-Saharan Africa. And what was, of course, tragic at that time is that we had just kind of developed antiretroviral medicine. So medication was available, which meant that HIV/AIDS was no longer a death sentence. It is no longer a death sentence to this day. With the right medication, you can live a full, complete life, and you can have children, and you really can. You just live a life like anyone else. It's become a chronic disease. But these medicines were simply not available to people in low and middle income countries, particularly in sub-Saharan Africa, because one treatment, like just to give an example, treatment costs were about $10,000 per patient per year. That's a huge amount. So at the end, in the late 1990s, one of the an Indian pharmaceutical company started to produce a generic version of antiretroviral medicine, and a generic version is simply the same medicine but not branded, not patent protected. So and that was on the market for around $350 per patient per year. So that's a huge difference. And South Africa decided to change its legislation to make affordable generic versions more available within the South African context. And I think it was about 39 pharmaceutical companies that together decided to sue the South African government. Actually, they, you have to sue Nelson Mandela because he, was the head of the government at that time, and that created an international outrage. At the very beginning, they had the support. These pharmaceutical companies had the support of developed countries like the United States and also the European Union. But there was so much outrage, the idea of, millions of people dying from HIV. Suddenly there is medicine available and they are trying to make that medicine available, and you're going to sue because you think that, changing the law is unconstitutional. Of course, that was, a PR nightmare. And I don't think the pharmaceutical company really, or the pharmaceutical companies really foresaw that. And that is really the start of, I would say, the access to medicine movement, and where we approach that topic specifically from a human rights perspective, from a right to health perspective. And since then, there has always been a whole lot of involvement from NGOs and from bottom up. So it wasn't a top-down approach. And that has, whether in the long term we have been successful, no, because there are still enough people that need to have access to medicines that they don't have. But it was, I think, to a certain extent, a victory, at least at that moment in time, that became, the suit was dropped. They didn't continue because they knew that it was not worth the fight.
Success story then.
Yes, kind of, yeah.
And then, Han, based on that, or maybe similar to that, how could you go into a bit more detail on how civil society has been involved in the UN Disability Convention?
Yes. So I think similarly as I mentioned before, they participate in the negotiation of the CRPD, which is was a huge success, and after that, from my research, I see that also the disabled people's organizations, they really use the CRPD as like guidance in their national advocacy. So there are many successful, I would say even before the CRPD, there were many successful examples in the UK, in the EU, and in the States that people with disabilities and their organizations are the pioneer in disability law and policy drafting. And after the CRPD, I think for persons with disabilities and their organizations, it's even more important and significant that they now have an international outlet to for advocacy and for address their frustration sometimes with the government, because even though with the CRPD they have the, as I said, the articles that ask the government to establish the implementation and monitoring mechanism, persons with disabilities are not included. And also, apart from that, I just want to follow on the what Jennifer has said about the what we call probably the international compliance of the the human rights treaties in general, because I think it's always an interesting topic, and you always get, like in my work, I always get a question from a person with disabilities like, okay, so you have an international treaty. Yeah, it's great. And I read it, it's very relevant to me, but why should I care about it, and how it will make my life better? I think a theory that many scholars have talked about, there are probably two main incentives for the states to comply with their obligations under the International Human Rights Treaty. Mainly, the first is what we call external incentives. For example, a state doesn't want to lose face in international platform. If everyone is every other country is practicing human rights and they're not, they feel a bit shameful, right? I mean, theoretically, because, and
they should,
yeah, exactly. And in other cases, there are more hardcore, we'll say, measure, for example, sanctions on another country. So that's probably an incentive for the state to follow their human rights obligations. And the third one, some people argue that it depends on the legitimacy of the international monitoring body. For example, if some country consider that I don't know, the CRPD treaty board, the Disability Convention treaty body is not, they don't really make good recommendations, and they don't really understand what's going on with my state. They probably won't follow. So that's the external incentives. But some more studies show that probably the internal incentives, or a combination of external incentives and internal incentives, are more important in such compliance. And my study also takes this approach, is that it actually requires like a mobilization between on a global scale. So, but the bottom-up approach, as you mentioned, is the most important one, because it's the, if the civil society and private sectors and probably the government and the legislative in a country, they accept the human rights norm as their value. Because, for example, I don't know, rule of law and democracy, if all the states say, yes, we value this, and this should be the core value of our country, they're more likely to follow their obligations, rather than some other some other treaty body tell me that I need to do this. So to achieve this, that the civil society and the international bodies, and sometimes even other member states, probably, for example, in many developed countries, they have the developmental program, so they can offer money or other resource and support to developing countries to practice their to improve their human rights practice. So I think all these factors, especially the internal factors, are very important in the human rights compliance in general.
Yeah.
Yeah.
We're coming to the end of our time, so I'll round this off just by saying a massive thank you to both of our resident experts for this episode. Thank you, Han. Thank you, Jen.
Thank you.
And before we go, one of the things we like to do at Let's Talk Human Rights is to ask you at the end to be as serious or as silly as you like, and to give us, if you could add one new human right to human rights law, what would it be? Han?
I think I borrowed the one that you mentioned in our discussion before. I think it would be really important for women to have free products, menstrual products. They're so expensive. If you're a woman, you know what I'm talking about. And I think also it'd be nice if we have like a compulsory, I don't know, leave for 1 or 2 days in a month.
Well, I can wholeheartedly agree, yes.
We have 2 more votes for that human right. Okay. Anything you'd like to add, Jen?
Yeah, so for my personal experience, I think like a right to breastfeed, because, you know, I've had a baby about a year ago, or a bit over a year ago, and, you know, just the institutional framework that an institutional framework that really allows you to properly breastfeed, I think would be great. I think we're really missing that. So I would add that to the human rights catalog.
2 very important and often overlooked human rights there, I think. Finally, if people want to find out more about you and your research, where can they find you?
Yeah, so for my research, of course, it's published in the Maastricht University website. But I also want to mention that my study is funded by the European Commission's Marie Curie Fund, and I'm part of the what we call the DARE network, short for Disability Advocacy Research in Europe. So we have 15 other amazing colleagues doing much more interesting study than mine. And if anyone find what I said about person with disabilities rights and research interesting, I think you should definitely check our website. It's called dareresearch.eu, and you can also find us on Facebook using Dare Research. Thank you. Thanks. Jen?
Yeah, so I'm also on the Maastricht University website, and unfortunately nowhere else, because I'm old school like that. So email, this is how you can contact me. And for anyone who is interested in and especially for the students actually who are interested in access to essential medicines as an issue, I recommend checking out UAEM, which is Universities Allied for Essential Medicines, and they have a Maastricht chapter, which is an organization, an NGO, student-led NGO, that deals peoples with access to essential medicines. And it was actually established by a group of Yale students who convinced their university and a pharmaceutical company to permit for the production of a generic version of the drug that was developed at Yale University with the pharmaceutical company together. And they said, actually universities have a kind of responsibility also. If we are, funding research, innovative research, then we should also have a responsibility to make sure that that innovation comes to the people that need it. So UAM does a lot of great work, and they are all over the world now. So if you are, you don't have to be a law student, even if you're like a med student and you're interested in this kind of work, then check them out.
Oh, that's super interesting. You heard it here first, ways to get involved in access to medicines. Then without further ado, thank you very much, Han. Thank you very much, Jen. Thank you everyone at home. If you want any further information on the centre, so it's the Maastricht Centre for Human Rights, you can find us also on the Maastricht University website. And we will see you next time. Thanks.